Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Welcome back to CBSN. The U.S. government is working to shine a light on the issue of suicide within our nation's police force. In June of 2020, Congress passed the Law Enforcement Suicide Data Collection Act. It requires the FBI to create a database to store any and all information pertaining to the growing suicide rate within the nation's law enforcement ranks. While the collection is set to launch in January, there are several pilot programs underway nationwide. According to the nonprofit organization Blue Help, 104 officers died by suicide in 2021. By comparison, 89 officers were killed in the line of duty as of August 31st. That number includes both felonious incidents, such as unprovoked attacks or ambushes, and accidental deaths, like a motor vehicle accident. The numbers indicate an officer is more likely to die by suicide than to be killed on the job. CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter Nicole Sganga joins us now for more on this. Hi, Nicole. So is there a knowledge behind what is driving the growing number of officer-related suicides across the country?
Well, Tanya, suicide among law enforcement is not a new phenomenon by any means, but the FBI's data collection really represents a colossal shift in how it's addressed. Post-traumatic stress disorder and depression have been estimated to affect police officers, with some studies citing numbers as high as 35% among the workforce. But the truth is that the full mental health picture has not yet been captured, even during a period of relative crisis for law enforcement. The FBI's new collection comes at a time when officers face unprecedented levels of stress and challenges to their own mental health. Officers we speak with at CBS News point to the uptick in violent crime, unprovoked attacks on officers, the COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of domestic terror, civil unrest, the emotional impact of calls for greater accountability and reform within law enforcement in the wake of the tragic killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others. For years, officers and law enforcement officials have told us that suicide and attempted suicide persisted as this silent epidemic among police ranks. But beginning in January, the U.S. government will be keeping track. In the meantime, Blue Help, a nonprofit organization founded by law enforcement officials, has kept these statistics. You referenced some of them. 104 law enforcement officers in the United States died by suicide so far in 2021, compared to non-COVID line of duty deaths, where felonious and accidental deaths were 89. You mentioned that as well so far this year. 2019 also served as a real flashpoint for lawmakers and police agencies across the country. In that year, 89 law enforcement officers died on the job feloniously or through accidental deaths. But in the same year, there were, get this, 239 officers taken by suicide, that tracked by Blue Help. And, that gaping discrepancy really prompted lawmakers to create this repository for these law enforcement deaths, which, as you noted, the FBI will be launching come January.
So these high numbers that we're hearing, could they partially be a result of tracking what was once considered a taboo subject and therefore perhaps not reported as accurately?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. I mean, and when an officer is killed feloniously, there's a protocol, right? There's investigations, there are honors, ceremonies, support for the family, and that doesn't exist for law enforcement suicides. In fact, I've spoken with widows of law enforcement officers who died by suicide who tell me that their health care was suspended on the very same day that their spouse died, that they received very little in the way of comfort or consolation in the aftermath of their loved one's death, let alone benefits. These families now fighting for their husband, brother, sister, sons, daughters to be considered a line of duty death, for their loved one's death to be considered that, for their names to be included on honor walls across the country, that pay tribute to fallen officers. And, part of the reason the FBI's decision to create the first ever government-sponsored body of research on law enforcement suicides is so important is because of what will accompany it, which is a greater understanding of the circumstances around both suicides and attempted suicides, which, frankly, the FBI hopes will facilitate law enforcement policy changes that are much needed. New training and resources within the ranks, which, by the way, extend beyond just police officers to include fire department personnel, criminal investigators, corrections officers, line of duty officers, and even 911 dispatch operators.
So I guess then, Nicole, what you're saying, there is the hope that the creation of this database will eventually lead to change in the way law enforcement treats suicide-related deaths moving forward.
Yeah, and there is a pilot program, we should mention, underway right now, Tanya, with a small sample of enforcement agencies nationwide participating. But certainly the FBI is aware of the stigma surrounding law enforcement suicides, the fear and even the lack of resources that might prevent agencies from reporting suicides, and in particular, attempted suicides. And so, the FBI has been collecting this data on a voluntary basis. It's also been long challenged by collecting this data. The FBI, even their most robust database, its violent crime database that we reported on earlier last week, sees only 85% participation. But the FBI really does hope it can capitalize on existing relationships with agencies who already report line of duty deaths, felonious killings, and accidental deaths. And they're making the argument right now to agencies across the country that understanding suicide in the ranks is an important public safety and public health imperative, that amid law enforcement existing talent and retention problems, understanding this trauma, the PTSD, the mental health challenges of officers will also help law enforcement agencies recruit more members and retain so many of the good men and women that wear the uniform. I want to share this with you. I spoke with Amy Blasher. She's the unit chief of the FBI and Law Enforcement Statistics Unit, who's helping launch this collection just about its historic nature. Here's what she had to say.
This will be the first national collection that will be reported from law enforcement to law enforcement. The types of data that we will collect will center around the circumstances of that event, again, of the suicides or attempted suicides. And the hope, the goal of this very important collection would be to learn about those circumstances, what led up to that event, so that better training or policies at these agencies, wellness programs could be developed based on this data.
And Tanya, I went on to ask Amy Blasher explicitly, is this collection aimed at preventing law enforcement suicide? And without hesitation, without question, she says that is the FBI's goal here.
So why are we having this conversation now, Nicole, and what are some of the next steps state and local law enforcement can take with this new information?
Yeah, Tanya, it's a great question. The concern about officer suicides has existed for years, decades, but the conversation about officer wellness has really picked up steam more recently. We know the Law Enforcement Suicide Data Collection Act was passed into law last June, but there are also relatively new bills being considered now on the state level. A new bill being considered in South Carolina's legislature, for example, would allow the state's more than 11,000 members of law enforcement, firefighters and volunteer firefighters, to receive workers' compensation if they're diagnosed with a mental or stress-related illness. A similar bill was introduced earlier this year in Connecticut. Wisconsin, passed legislation in April that makes it easier for emergency responders suffering from PTSD to file workers' compensation claims. And these are just a few examples. But, you'll recall that earlier this year, the American public was reminded of the prevalence of suicide among police ranks after the suicides of Capitol Police Officer Howard Liebengood and D.C. police officers Jeffrey Smith, Gunther Hashida, and Kyle DeFreitag, who responded to the assault on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Here in Washington, D.C., we did not see any citywide processions or motorcades for those fallen officers. We learned of their deaths in some cases weeks later from agencies, and their families right now are having to fight to have those deaths acknowledged as being line of duty deaths. So, it's stories like these that have propelled law enforcement suicide to the forefront of the conversation. Officers, family members we speak with hope the FBI's data collection launching in January will be the first step in a much larger effort to address this silent epidemic. Tanya.
All right, Nicole Sganga, thank you so much. We appreciate it.